So you're sticking around for the after party?
I hope so. Alrighty. We're gonna start now. So, hello everyone. My name is Roberto, and I will be helping with tech support and moderating the chat. This session is being recorded. I don't work for Zoom, but if you're having problems, mention it in the chat, and we will see if we can help. We will be having a Q&A at the end of the presentation. With the Q&A, write your questions in the Q&A button or in the chat. We will get to them. And then just general rules, please keep questions relatively family friendly, and also don't be a jerk. Then today we have Iain from Terranauts, and he's going to be giving his presentation about Themistocles and the space program. Take it away, Iain.
Thanks, Roberto. I'm Iain Christie, and I'm the host of a podcast called Terranauts. So if you really want to know about the Greco-Persian Wars, it just so happens that there's another session running in parallel talking about exactly that. I'm only going to talk about that for about the first, 3 to 5 minutes of the presentation. So when, and I'm just going to share my screen here quickly, do a little bit of shameless self-promotion. When I heard that the theme this year was going to be crossings, I actually knew immediately what I wanted to talk about. To understand why, though, you need to understand a little bit about my podcast. People who were in the last panel heard the same kind of spiel, but just in case you weren't there. Terranauts is a podcast about the history of our humanity to leave the Earth. But it's told from the perspective of people who, although they do that work in space, never actually leave the planet, which means that they're a lot like me, because I have worked most of my adult life at getting human inventions and other humans into space. Which means, that a part of me has spent a lot of time out there, but I've never actually gotten on board a spacecraft and taken the journey myself, obviously. So when I heard that the topic of the conference was going to be crossings, I knew what I had to talk about, because I've talked about this topic before. I first came up with the idea for a short talk I gave at the opening of an international space conference about 7 years ago. And at that, because it was an opening of a space conference, I was looking for a way to talk about the fact that I think that the basic instinct that animates and motivates us to go to space, it's not new. It doesn't have anything to do with space. It's not modern. I think it's actually been animating humans since, well, probably since there have been humans. Certainly, it's been animating humans for as long as there are records about human activities. I'm convinced of that. And so I wanted to tell a story about two politicians separated by more than 2.5 millennia, both of whom I think appealed to the same basic motivation to convince their fellow citizens to reach beyond their local horizons and work together to achieve something much, much bigger than themselves. So let me see if I can, there we go. The story starts in 493 BC. It starts out in the city of Athens, which at the time was a middle-sized city, one of a number of Hellenic urban centers in what we now call Greece. It was honestly, it was pretty unremarkable at the time. If it stood out at all, it was arguably because all of the adult male citizens participated in the governance of the city. It was a democracy, which at the time was an innovation. The early Athenian version of democracy was a bit different than the way we experience it today, and political power wasn't distributed equally by any means, since only adult males could be citizens, and only those in the upper classes could actually hold political office. But still, every citizen in Athens got a chance to vote on the issues of the day. There weren't any kings or emperors, there were only citizens. So as I was saying, in 493, Athens was an up-and-coming Hellenic city, or polis, experimenting with kind of a unique form of government, but it wasn't the leader of the Hellenic world in the way that we're used to thinking of it. And its experiment with democracy was at that point just that. It was an interesting experiment and not yet recognized as effectively the birth of a major political ideology. But a Greek politician named Themistocles, this is a picture of a statue of Themistocles, in some ways wanted to change all of that. When he got up in front of his fellow citizens on that day in 493, he had a vision of taking Athens to a new place, a place that no Hellenic city had actually ever gone before, a place that the vast majority of his fellow citizens hadn't even really thought of going. He wanted to turn Athens into the greatest maritime power of the day, greater than any of the other Greek cities, and even greater than the mighty Persian Empire. Well, how? Well, you see, at that moment in time, the voters of Athens had a big question that they were talking about. It was a challenge, but it was a good challenge. You see, Athens owned a silver mine, and normally it produced enough silver to fund public projects, put some money in the treasury. Well, in that particular year, it had had a particularly good year and struck a rich vein, and there was a substantial surplus that actually needed to be distributed. And so the citizens of Athens were meeting to decide where to spend the windfall. Now, most of the assembled probably thought that they were just going to decide to share the proceeds according to some agreed to formula. Many had probably already decided how they were going to spend their share. And so, of course, that plan came up and was put to a vote. It kind of looked like a done deal. And then Themistocles got up and headed to the podium. And he had other ideas. He didn't want Athenians to put the money into their pockets or into a new house or new furniture or into other ways of making their lives easier. No, he wanted them to vote to put the money into building the biggest navy in the world. 200 of these, 200 triremes. Now, to understand why that's such a big idea, you need to understand a few things. First of all, the trireme was the height of technology of the day. A lot of the citizens of Athens might never have seen one. It was that advanced technology. And building such a fleet would not only take all of that excess silver from the mines, but it was going to require a lot of timber, a lot of flax for linen, a lot of brass and other metals for fittings. More importantly, it was going to require crews for the fleet of 200 triremes that would need as many as 17,000 citizens. And at the time, there were only about 30,000 citizens in Athens. So really what Themistocles was asking was not just to spend some silver on some ships. He was asking for his fellow citizens to commit not just their 10 drachmas or whatever it was going to have been, but themselves, and in fact, their offspring, to an immense civic project that was going to take years to complete, which seems like a pretty big ask. And maybe the only thing more surprising than the proposal was the fact that they said yes. They did commit to it. Despite the objections of another prominent politician, Aristides, the citizens of Athens voted to create a navy unlike any that existed at the time. And although they didn't know it, they thereby ensured that the Greek civilization would survive an invasion by that same mighty Persian Empire a dozen years later. And in fact, Themistocles would lead the combined Greek fleet to victory at the Battle of Salamis that caused the Persians to actually retreat and never return. Those same Athenian citizens also set the stage for Athens to become one of the preeminent cities of the Hellenic world. And they set the stage for Athens to emerge from the conflict with Persia in a position of leadership, and that Athens would go on to lead a powerful maritime empire, and that Athens would become a seat of philosophy and culture, and that Athenians would export their new democratic form of government and effectively become what many now consider to be the cradle of modern civilization. Yeah, it's certainly fair to say that the world we live in today would probably look very different if the Athenians had not followed Themistocles that day. But why? Why did they agree to donate their current prosperity and future efforts and livelihoods to the project? What did Themistocles say to the assembly on that day? Well, we actually don't know. But I think I would be surprised if he didn't sound a lot like another politician 2,500 years later when he challenged his fellow citizens to endorse his vision for a massive civic project that would take them to a new frontier and thereby secure their place in history. And of course, the politician I'm talking about is John F. Kennedy. And this is where the story of Themistocles merges with the story of the space program. In September of 1962, JFK took the stage at Rice University in Houston and made his famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech, in which he said, quote, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept and one we are unwilling to postpone," unquote. And in that moment, I think he was appealing to exactly the same instincts that Themistocles must have appealed to 2,500 years earlier. And it's what I've taken to calling the collective power of the big idea. I think that as human beings, we have a natural desire to do big things. But we have an even more basic instinct to do them together because we're a tribal species. Millennia of evolution have encoded in our genes the certainty that our success, and in fact our survival, depends on the success of our group. Making a contribution to the success of a group enterprise is one of the most satisfying things that we can do. And I believe that our physical and neurological biology makes that true. It's the same fundamental urge that keeps us checking how many likes our social media posts have gotten. Knowing not only that we're part of a group, but that we're making a contribution that is valued by that group is an urge that is coded deep in our old brains. It is this fundamental urge, I would argue, that has made many people like me Terranauts. Why I started working on the space program in the first place, and why the addiction to scratching this fundamental itch has kept me at it for 35 years. When I started working in the space business, it was honestly in order to replace the income from my graduate scholarship that expired 2 years into a 4-year degree. My initial jobs, honestly, were a bit like my graduate research. I certainly treated them that way. They were tasks that I more or less could perform on my own. The results were to some extent divorced from the overall progress of any particular project, as far as I could tell. I mean, I checked in periodically and got advice and direction, but I was not really part of a group effort. But I remember the day when that changed. And that was the day that I agreed to take the job at the Johnson Space Center. My boss, Paul, had offered me the job almost a year previously, and I remember the moment because I laughed at him. At the time, I thought I was going to continue to be an academic. I was going to go on and do postdoctoral work and eventually become a professor. 6 months later, after having surveyed the postdoctoral prospects and compared them to my desires to both have a roof over my head and enough to eat, I reconsidered his offer. I also reconsidered because by that time I had actually started to work full-time in the office and to understand what we were really trying to do. We were trying to convince NASA and the Canadian Space Agency to use the technology that my company was working on to help build the International Space Station. Now, at the time, I really didn't know anything about what that meant, but I knew that I wanted to be a part of it. And the collective power of the big idea was already drawing me in. And so I found myself handing in the final draft of my thesis and getting in my car with my wife, our 2 cats, and our worldly belongings and heading for Houston, Texas. And when I arrived at the Johnson Space Center, I found out what it really was to be caught up in the collective power of the big idea. If there was ever an organization that operated on that basis, it was NASA and the Johnson Space Center. There's an anecdote that's frequently passed around about how in the 1960s, the measure of how dedicated NASA was to JFK's vision was that you could ask anyone in a JSC building, right down to the caretaker staff, what their job was, and they would tell you that it was to send a man to the moon and bring him home safely. I mean, this is usually trotted out by the organizational behavior gurus who want to make a point about alignment in an organization. And I'm sure it's actually an exaggeration, but maybe not as much of one as you might think. I mean, I had an office at the Johnson Space Center on site in the middle of the robotics section of the Mission Operation Directorate of the shuttle program. And to work there was to work in the middle of a bunch of people who knew that their job was flying spacecraft for a living. They ate it, they breathed it, they talked about it, they lived it every single day. To work in that environment was suddenly to be captured by the concepts that human can and did leave the planet on a regular basis. And they didn't do it by accident. They got there and they got home again because of the work that was done in that building by everyone in that building. There were no unimportant roles or functions. No one could mail it in. The success of all depended on the efforts of everyone. Wow, was that ever addictive? This is a fact which is obvious to me now in hindsight. At the time, the realization dawned on me a little bit more slowly. I mean, at first, I kind of treated the job a bit like grad school. I worked on my tasks and checked in with others, got feedback, and there were lots of challenges that were new to me and which I took a lot of satisfaction in meeting. But slowly it started to dawn on me that others were not only trusting me to get my bits right, but also depending on my work to make sure that their pieces of the project were successful as well. Within even a few weeks, I realized that these people really expected to build a space station in orbit. And they really expected that the work that I was doing was going to help make that possible. And that's a realization that brings you up short. If there's anything that keeps you at your desk late at night or drives you from your bed to your computer in the middle of the night, it's the thought that the others' efforts might be wasted if you don't get your part right. And of course, in the end, we did go on to build the space station on orbit. And the work that I did at JSC during that time was a part of that effort. I can't look at pictures of the space station without being reminded of that, because the space station is covered in dots. You see the black, and in some cases white, dots that cover the space station are only there because of the system that I was helping to develop called the Space Vision System. It was used to assemble the bits of the space station. In fact, some of them are there where they are because I did the calculation to decide where to put them. So every time I see those dots, I see the small individual contribution that I made to a really, really big idea that actually came to fruition. And obviously that gives me a sense of pretty deep satisfaction. That's pretty hard to match. And actually one of the moments of greatest satisfaction I had was not from looking at the real space station, but actually looking at a fictional one. I was on an airplane flight and I was watching the movie The Martian. And in the movie, there's a scene that involves a space station orbiting the Earth. Now, as part of sort of the establishing shots for that scene, there's images from the outside of the space station, and the space station has dots on it. The dots don't play any role in the plot of the movie. I'm sure that the people who designed the models or the sets had no idea why there are dots on the real space station, but they just assumed that if you have a space station, it has to have black dots on it. And then the realization dawned on me that I actually raised my hands in the touchdown symbol in my seat, because I realized that I had in some small way been part of something that had literally become a pop culture icon, because space stations have dots. Yeah, they do, but partly because of the job that I did. Again, wow. Now, at the time when I started working on that project, the building of the space station was literally a decade in the future. There were many years, many successes, and many challenges between those days and the moment that I would celebrate in that airline seat. And there's a lot of vignettes from those days that have stayed with me, apart from simply the long hours, especially the hours spent in meetings. I remember, for instance, driving to the Space Center in Houston through streets that were so far flooded that the water was actually coming over the hood of my car. But I had to get to the Space Center because there was a simulation session that involved the astronauts, which could not easily be postponed, and that really needed to go well. I remember traveling to KSC for my first ever in-vehicle test, which is a test where you actually install your equipment on the shuttle on the ground for the first time. And at the time I was suffering from Bell's palsy, which causes partial facial paralysis. The condition was for me not debilitating, but it wasn't very comfortable. And in retrospect, I probably should have been on sick leave. But knowing that there was no one else at the time who understood the equipment well enough to conduct the test, and knowing that all of the efforts of the entire development team could come to nothing if the test wasn't successful, I went. And I remember at the end of a long test day, sitting on the mats on the floor of the mid deck of the space shuttle in my bunny suit, because you had to wear bunny suits on board, and it was covered in mats because they put mats down when it was on the ground. So I was sitting in my bunny suit on the mats as the KSC engineers completed the closeout activity, because none of us could leave until everybody could leave. And so this was necessary so we could end the test day. And I remember thinking as I sat there that the wall I was leaning against was actually the hull of a spacecraft that in barely 2 months' time would be the only thing between 5 humans and the void of space. And then I remember thinking at that moment that fatigue, hunger, and facial paralysis notwithstanding, there really wasn't anywhere else in the world you could have paid me any money to be at that moment. And because at that moment, I was feeling the collective power of the big idea. to feel that I was a constructive part of something that was so much bigger than I was, and which was so incredibly exceptional, was something that really did speak to my deepest human urges. And in the time since then, I've seen countless other people respond to the same basic urge to be part of something larger than themselves and to make a positive contribution to it. I've seen people accomplish amazing things, to focus their abilities and their faculties and their talents on problems that seemed insoluble until, of course, they were solved. I specifically remember a time on a later program when a team of engineers from Neptec, the company that I worked for, traveled to KSC to install the new orbiter boom sensor system camera. This was a sensor that NASA was going to use on the very first flight after the Columbia disaster to make sure that there was no damage to the outside of the shuttle that would prevent reentry, because of course it was damage to the outside of the shuttle that caused the loss of Columbia. The whole sensor system was a complicated assemblage of various pieces that had already been mostly designed to perform other tasks, spare parts from the original Canadarm, sensors that had been designed for other purposes, wiring and connectors and electronics that had all been adapted for a use on the OBSS that no one knew existed barely a year before. It had been done that way because it was the only way to get the space shuttle back up and flying in a pretty short period of time. Because not addressing the problem would mean that the shuttle would never fly again safely. And taking too long to solve the problem would probably mean that Congress and the public would run out of patience before we got to try it. So talk about being part of a project with a really large group of people with a tough job that really, really has to work. That was return to flight. At any rate, this test at KSC was actually the first chance to assemble the whole orbiter boom sensor system, because it literally couldn't be assembled anywhere else except on the shuttle. And it didn't work. When all of the pieces were put together, the sensors couldn't communicate properly with the control station. Neither of the two sensors, ours and another company's sensor, neither of the sensors could be made to function correctly. The team from Neptec and from NASA and the other contractors spent pretty much 24 hours straight probing and testing and scoping. And they eventually determined that there was electrical interference or crosstalk between all of the various electronics at the end of the boom. We were basically just trying to fit too many round pegs into too few square holes, and it wasn't working. But undaunted and with enough data in hand, the team sat down on the spot and redesigned the cabling and the connectors to overcome the problem. The only issue was that a whole new cable and connector had to be designed, approved, manufactured, tested, then installed and tested again to make sure that A, it fixed the problem, and B, it didn't break something that already worked. And oh yes, it had to be done in a week, because in order to support the launch schedule. But it did get done. I'm actually not sure. I'm still not sure how. I mean, for anyone who's worked on a program like the space shuttle for an organization like NASA, you'll understand how many people had to make a personal commitment to getting it done for that to be successful. I mean, from the machine shop guys where we placed the emergency order, and we literally stood there while they manufactured, to the Neptec engineers and quality control staff who designed and built the cable and the connectors, to the NASA and other contractor engineers who approved the design, reviewed the test results in the middle of the night, to the whole crew that worked back at KSC to get it installed and to prove that it worked. It was a tiny but massive effort that required everyone involved to lose sleep and take risks and to trust people that they did not know except by reputation. And they did it because the collective effort demanded it. They did it because they knew they could make the effort succeed. And it did, because ultimately the OBSS camera system flew on every shuttle mission after the Columbia disaster. And on every mission, it was used to survey the outside of the shuttle and give flight controllers, mission managers, and astronauts the confidence that it was safe to come home in their spacecraft. So why does all of that matter? I mean, why go back all the way back to Themistocles just to tell some war stories from my time in the space business? Well, yeah, but beyond that, because I wanted to say that there is a reason why I'm here talking about being a Terranaut and why I talk about it on my podcast and why I assume people tune in and listen. And that's because the endeavor of going to in space really does embody that collective power, the big idea that speaks to something fundamental in our nature. Now, space isn't the only way to access that urge. There are lots of ways that humans act collectively to accomplish big things. But going to space to do practically anything is always going to be one of those things, because space is hard. And because no one gets to space alone. It's always a group effort. And because space will always be a place where there will be big ideas that require collective action to achieve them. Because space will always be a place where humans choose to do what is hard because it's hard. And because we know that going to space will force us to organize and measure ourselves. And because in accepting those challenges, we'll connect to something fundamental in our humanity, just as those Athenians did on that hilltop 2,500 years ago. Thanks. That's it for my presentation. And I believe the floor now stands open for questions.
The floor does stand open for questions. And if everyone does have a question, feel free to submit it into the chat, the Q&A box, or raise your hand up to ask with your actual voice, because we have those.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a big group here, folks. If you want to get on screen and have a conversation, I'd rather do that than answer your written questions, but it's up to you.
Well, we do have a written question, but I feel like it may have been a reference to something. And it's from Cecil, and it is, why does Rice play Texas?
Is that the first line of a riddle, Cecil? I spent my entire time at JSC listening to people say "hook 'em horns" and "go Aggies." So I was never in the middle of that. Although I did go to a lot of high school football games in Houston, and that is a cultural experience if there ever was one. By the way,
growing up in Houston, I can tell you that is the truth. But go Cougs. So we actually do have someone, and Cecil did say it's in Kennedy's speech.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Cecil, come on, put your hand up. Let's hear why. I'm interested in this story now.
But first, we do have Bill who wants to ask a question.
Yes, Bill. Nice to see you again.
Bill, you are allowed to talk.
Yeah, I heard your last one. Psychologically, how many times did you quit?
Well, I'd certainly have to take off, all my gloves and both my shoes to be able to count that high.
Yeah.
All the time. And or I would have, if this had been my PhD thesis, if my PhD had been this hard, I'd have quit long before I got done. The reason I didn't was because quitting wouldn't have been quitting on me. It would have been quitting on everybody else.
Yeah, got it.
That's why and that's the whole point. When it got really hard, really, really hard, the reason you didn't quit was because of everybody else, not because it meant a lot to you, but because you just couldn't live with disappointing everybody else by not being able to deliver for them. And that's why we do things that seem impossible. We don't, there are some very, very special individuals who achieve amazing things in their own basement. But most of the time when we do amazing things, it's because we don't want to disappoint the other people we're working with. There really is something in our biology. We know we're so dependent on the success of the group around us that failing the group is a much bigger deal than failing ourselves.
Yeah, I'd agree. Thanks.
We have a question from Cecil. So SLS seems to have lost the plot. Is there a way forward for it? Or should we just put it aside and go with Starship, New Glenn, Vulcan, whatever?
I'm not sure I agree with you. SLS has the reputation of having lost the plot, but then so did Shuttle, so did Station. Come to that, so did Apollo at times. The one issue about the collective power, the big idea is it's a collective power inside the people who are involved in it. The people that I know that are involved in SLS firmly believe that they are going to do great things with that spacecraft. Most of us who are outside of that program don't understand the things that they do, and they don't understand why they believe that. So I'm not sure that I agree with you that it's lost the plot. It's a constant problem of, it's a publicly funded enterprise. How does it go about proving to the people who are paying for it that it hasn't lost the plot? I don't disagree with you that that's an issue, but knowing some of the people and knowing the kinds of challenges they're facing, I don't think it's as bad as people in the media want to make you believe it is, at least partially because, of course, the media needs there to be a competition between that and between SpaceX and Blue Origin and whatever. So they try to make it sound like it's a one or the other kind of thing, and that you've got two people pursuing very different ways of doing the same thing. One must be right and one must be wrong. I don't think that's the case, actually.
Okay, just giving you the 10-minute mark as well.
I'm not sure what Cecil means by the MLT debacle with Bechtel. Scares me.
I don't either.
Cecil, do you want to enlighten us what you're talking about?
I can allow you to talk, Mobile Launch Tower 2.0 for Block 1B.
Okay, well, now we're getting into more fairly far inside baseball. So I'm happy to talk about it offline, Cecil, but I don't know enough of the details. I'm not current enough on stuff to talk about it in any intelligent way right now.
So I'm a Houstonian. So
yes,
I do want to ask, how was your time in Houston during your time at NASA?
Right. So this was the mid 90s. This was the time of "Don't blame me, I voted for Bush." That was the prominent. Well, that bumper sticker and "God, Guns, and Guts made America great. Let's keep all three." Those were the two bumper stickers I remember from my time in Houston. It was weird being a Canadian living in Houston because, on the surface, the culture there is very similar to culture I was used to. We got the same television stations, and then you actually had to watch television stations, right? So, and a lot of the cultural references were the same, but it was also fundamentally different. And after about a year and a half, my wife and I decided it was time to come home because we just felt like strangers in a strange land. Like either we were going to have to assimilate or we were going to have to leave, because it was similar enough that being different all the time just felt odd. It would have been easier if we were living in a place where they spoke a different language, I think. That and the heat drove me out.
Yep, that's why I'm up here in the north. Yeah, and then you mentioned driving in the floods and all that.
God, yeah.
Yeah, it still happened.
I know that there was more than 12 inches of rain that night because we had friends who had kids who had a kiddie pool that was a foot deep, and it was overflowing in the morning.
Oh man.
Like a foot of rain fell that evening. The streets were literally covered in water. I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, and it's only gotten worse. So
no, it wasn't one of the hurricanes. This was just Cecil said Allison. I was actually gone from Houston during any of the big hurricanes, thankfully. The office that we had there at the time, we kept an office in Houston. We actually had to evacuate during I can't remember which one it was, but there was a spate there, especially in the late 90s, when it seemed like every 6 months we were having an emergency. In some ways, Houston is a very strange place to put a space center.
Is Cape Canaveral
better? Just like the Kennedy Space Center is a terrible place to launch spacecraft from if you're worried about lightning. Mm-hmm. I went to way more space shuttle launches than I ever saw because most of them were canceled. Houston is literally happens when you put a city in a swamp. Yeah. Okay. Well, now you're going to get me to tell my Houston stories. I had a friend there when I moved there, talking to somebody who said, well, about Houston, the thing about Houston is you get your triple digit temperatures, your triple digit humidity, and hail is only a local call.
That's so very true. I don't miss humidity. So, oh, Cecil grew up in Houston. We have
Yeah,
a
well,
lot of
there you go.
Houston
Well,
people here.
I had a feeling he was talking like a native. I tell you
Yep.
what, Cecil.
Yeah.
It was a great experience, though. I mean, working at the Johnson Space Center was certainly a highlight of my career, even though it's over 30 years ago now. Not because of living in Houston, but also just because of being exposed to that culture. I mean, it really was an exceptional place to work. Other than maybe someplace in Russia, it's the only place in the world where people's job was flying spacecraft. I mean, people who worked at Canadian space agencies be lucky if they worked on 2 flights in their entire career. People in Houston were working on 2 flights at a time. It really was a place where people professionally got off the planet, and they didn't think it was odd to be doing that.
Mm-hmm. Then I think I need to say this is the 5-minute mark. And then I'm going to answer Cecil's question. Number 2, Kirkendall. And yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so if anyone has like anything they want to say, oh, Bill, you want to talk again? There we go. Oh, we can't hear you if you're talking.
Oops. Mute, unmute. Sorry, Bill, we're still not hearing you. All right. Well, we're just about ready to wrap it up anyways. If you figure it out while we're talking, Bill, just interrupt. But I think we're due to end at 25 after 5, right? So so I'll just make another shameless plug for Terranauts. It's not the largest podcast in the world. It might be one of the smaller ones actually represented here today. But we've gotten up a fair head of steam. This is actually my 3rd season, so I'm up to the middle of the Gemini program now. If anybody wants to go back and check the back catalog, there's lots to binge there. So it's on Acast if anybody wants to come looking for it. And of course, if anybody wants to chat offline, I'm going to stick around after the fact here today, but also happy to take it up offline. I don't have a Twitter account, but there's lots of other ways they get a hold of me, including Discord, if you want to do that. I appreciate everybody who turned out. And if you're listening to this in the future in the recording, I appreciate you listening to the recording. Okay, Bill, I've tap danced for as long as I can. Let's see if we've got your audio sorted out yet. I don't think so.
Alrighty, so I think we're gonna end the session here. You can find Iain on the main lobby chat if you want to keep chatting, as well as in the breakout rooms. And also we do have the keynote speaker time, and then we'll have an after party after this.
There you go. There you go. Well, we'll see everybody there.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone.